All right, sir.
Okay. Rick Frederickson, good morning.
Hi, George. Good to be with you.
Rick, you grew up on the north side of Des Moines, up around Park Fair. Tell us about that.
Cambridge Street, 1949 is when I was born, actually a few blocks away from there, but I lived in the same house since I could remember anything on Cambridge Street. My high school and junior high and grade school were all within a few blocks when kids used to walk to school. I watched Park Fair Shopping Center be built out of the old Des Moines University as a little kid. And the house is still there. I love to go by. My mom was the second parent. She died 3 years ago. So it's been about 3 years since I've been in that old house, and that's the only place I know. Took some journalism courses at North High School, and that was kind of my first taste of it. And Riverview Park was another great landmark in the neighborhood, which closed in the 70s, I believe it was.
Triplets Toys at Park
Triplets
Fair.
Toy Town. And now the old Park Fair Shopping Center is about to go through its umpteenth renovation, I guess. So,
What was the Des Moines media like growing up? What'd you listen to?
Russ Van Dyke and Paul Rhodes were the anchormen on KRNT television back then, Channel 8. KRNT Radio, the big radio stations are still on the air today. They may not have the same call letters. The Register and the Evening Tribune were the newspapers that we would read and subscribe to. And of course, there was no internet, information available. So it was pretty much strictly radio and the main broadcast stations. There was obviously no cable at that time either.
What got you interested in journalism?
Surprisingly, it wasn't those first few classes at North High School when I took my Journalism 101, but I went into the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, and out of boot camp, they gave me an assignment to go to broadcasting school of all things. So rather than pick up a rifle, I picked up a microphone, and the school was called the Defense Information School at Indianapolis at that time. Among the much more famous graduates, Steve Croft from 60 Minutes and a lot of other guys and gals have come out of there, but still it's kind of an unusual way to get exposed to journalism. So I was forced into it. I was ordered to journalism school out of Marine Corps boot camp. And so they gave me my career, and I did end up going to Vietnam as a reporter rather than a grunt.
So you went straight from North High School, 68 you graduated, 67?
67.
Okay. And you went straight to the Marine Corps?
I took a couple months to try college, and I decided I wasn't ready to continue hitting the books. And at that time, there was still a draft for the Vietnam War. So I thought, I had a friend that was in the Marine Corps, and he was influential. And I thought, I'll just do this first and then come back and go to college free on the GI Bill. And I did come back and take a few classes, but the training and experience I had, sort of outweighed, going to school again. So I went right into broadcasting after I came back from Vietnam.
Okay. In Vietnam, what did you cover? What did you end up doing? What was your assignment?
It was the biggest story of my life, and to this day, it's still the biggest story of my life, covering the war. I worked for AFVN, the American Forces Vietnam Network, which was a true network of radio and television stations from the Delta to the DMZ. Was our little logo, AFVN. The Mekong Delta in the south and the DMZ, which separated North and South Vietnam to the north. Probably 10 or so radio and TV stations. I was in the Saigon station, the headquarters station, and we would feed radio and television reports to the affiliates upcountry. So I was there for the full year. I was the Vietnam War news editor for a time when I would attend the military briefings every afternoon in downtown Saigon, come back and write from their press releases. And primarily, we would disseminate the news rather than gather the news. But every once in a while, I covered Richard Nixon in his visit to the Delta as one of the first stories I ever covered with a camera crew.
What was the AFVN operation like? Did you have film cameras for TV?
Had film for television. We still had 2-inch reel-to-reel videotape. It was a black and white station. Interestingly, we had FM stereo. It must have been one of the first computerized FM, and the machine was as big as this room. It sat in the lobby of the AFVN Radio TV broadcast center. And it was like an automated FM station. But it was pretty basic compared to today. We still had kinescope, but our field crews were shooting in 16 millimeter film. I don't even think there was a mag stripe that provided audio on the film at that time.
We used to shoot the old Bell and Howell handheld camera.
Yeah, but mostly, as I said, we were an organization to distribute the news. So we gathered it from all of the main networks. We used to get the Walter Cronkite news on a reel-to-reel 2-inch videotape. It would come a week late from Hawaii. And we would, most of it, we get the rundown, and most of it we just have to mark off because it was dated. But there was usually a good feature story or something that was still of interest to the troops in the field. So we get film from ABC News, and they send us a lot of news film. A lot of it related to the war, and some of it we were prohibited from using. And I was involved in a big censorship issue at that time. I was not a quote ringleader, but there was probably 8 or 10 young journalists at AFVN who protested the censorship that we were, forced to engage in. The Defense Department, dictated that troops in the field get the same news as civilians in the States, and we tried to follow the rules. But when it came to kind of sensitive stories of a military accident or casualty counts that couldn't be verified, strictly had to attribute to the U.S. military rather than unknown sources. When Nixon announced the first troop withdrawal, everybody in the world knew about it before the troops in Vietnam, because we had to wait for an official Department of Defense source. We couldn't use it from AP or UPI. So as a result, the guys going home were the last in the world to know about it. So we actually made so there were some protests. It wasn't anti-war, it was freedom of speech, freedom of information kind of protest. And we ended up getting a congressional investigation, and some of us were sent upseas because of our protest. And when I look back now, I don't really think it was as serious as we made it out to be. I think the military has a right to restrict the flow of some news. After all, we were broadcasting in the war zone. I'd be curious to know, here in 2007, how things are working out in Iraq. Probably the civilian media is going crazy on all of the accidents and the conflict, the bloodshed, and maybe the military is still kind of restricting what the military broadcasters are putting on the air.
Now, were there any repercussions for you? Were you sent back home out of this deal? Or what?
Yeah, I basically quit my job, and I don't think you can really do that, but they allowed me to leave my job, and I was on Huntley and Brinkley. They interviewed me, and there were stories in the hometown media here, and I was sent up country to an island station on the top of a mountain island in Nha Trang off the coast of Vietnam, and that's where I spent my last couple of months in Vietnam. And then they asked me if I wanted to get out early just to kind of get rid of me, and I said sure. And at that time, the war was kind of beginning the withdrawals were beginning, and I was in for 3 years, so there wasn't really a lot of time for them to reassign me back in the States anyway. So it kind of worked out all the way around.
What'd you do up at the mountaintop station?
Read local news, and most of it still came from the network in Saigon, but they had a local studio for a much smaller presence in their affiliate stations to just read local news, to kind of have a local face or voice in the case of radio on the air there.
Well, what would be the local news that you would do in Vietnam? Trooper Smith went out today and shot a bear or something like that, or?
Actually, I think a lot of it was just reading the news that was supplied to us from the network. They'd write the stories and send it up by teletype, and we would read what was a local newscast, and maybe there would be something on, the Green Berets, had a change of command ceremony, something that might not make the network newscast, but might apply to the area of Nha Trang where the Green Beret headquarters was.
This censorship issue, was it a particular event that caused the protest, or was it just things in general?
It was just an accumulation of commanders telling us that you can't use this piece, or maybe in the Walter Cronkite rundown or the ABC films that we would get, something that would attract their attention. A rocket hits a tree and bounces and ricochets and kills some American troops. They would write through that dated when maybe it wasn't dated, and everybody back home would get that information, but it's kind of demoralizing to hear that stuff to the troops. And I think I'm much more sympathetic to it now than when I was a teenager. And at the time, the military said, largely it's just a bunch of young guys who are kind of feeling their oats and expressing this freedom of information, which I still fight for today as a journalist. But now, what is it, 40 or some years later, I look back and I think, it probably wasn't nearly as bad as we had made it out to be.
Do you think as we get older, we get smarter?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, accumulation of knowledge.
You were discharged in 1970?
Honorably, I might say.
That's always good to know.
Despite that, yeah.
Came back to Des Moines.
I did.
And I think you were telling me that you started in March of 1970 at KRNT Television and Radio.
Correct.
That's the same date that I started over at WHO TV.
Mm-hmm.
How'd you get the job at Channel 8?
Excuse me. Actually, I came back to the job I had left at a men's clothing store in downtown Des Moines called Markovis's.
Oh, sure.
They held the job for me, and I came back as the assistant manager. I used to just be a stock boy. I started there when I was 14 years old, 50 cents an hour, and I came back to that job. And
Markovis's was a very stylish store.
It was very stylish. They also sold things for big and tall men, and they also had a line of military people. GIs would come in and buy, everything from patches to fatigues to combat boots. No weapons or anything like that, but it was they had three main lines which helped support the store. The son now runs it. It's called G&L Clothing in Des Moines. But one day I was waiting on customers, and two guys came in, and during that discussion, one friend told his buddy, I just applied for a job as a news reporter at KRNT. And I was back about 2 months, and I thought, I can do that. So after I sold him a shirt or a pair of pants, they walked out the door. I got on the phone and immediately called. And I think it was Paul Rhodes, one of the guys that I grew up watching on TV. I said, hey, I hear you have a job. I'd like to compete for it. And later I was in, and Russ and Paul took me into Russ's office and gave me a handful of wire copy and a little reel-to-reel tape recorder and set me down at a typewriter. I was at for technology at the time, and said, write a newscast and record it, and we'll come in and listen to it. And they must have liked enough. I had pretty good experience. I had almost 3 years of training and on-the-air experience, so I ended up getting the job. I guess there's a lesson there in keeping your mouth shut when you've applied for a job and telling your friends in private.
Or keep your ears open.
Yeah, that's right. That's that too.
So you start to work over at Channel 8 and KRNT Radio at the time. What do they have you do?
I was a cub reporter, my first job in commercial radio and television. I was on the early morning radio shift with George Wiley, and we would alternate radio newscasts. After my radio shift, Mark Minnick was the reporter at the Polk County Courthouse. He broke me in as a reporter over there, and I'd take my 16 millimeter Bell and Howell camera and would cover court cases, look through to see who is sentenced today, tax. Everything used to be in one office, so it was everything from tax valuations to murder convictions to exciting trials to boring stories. And that was my early years. Later, I started doing noon television, later weekend anchoring television news. And then they went to dual anchors. I mean, up for a while, it was still, Paul Rhodes did the 6 o'clock news and Russ Van Dyke did the 10 o'clock news. And there was a time when they went to dual anchors, and I was the dual anchor for both of those guys. So my reputation largely rests on those two famous pioneer broadcasters in central Iowa. And I got to read the 6 with Paul and the 10 with Russ. And after about 12 years, I moved on, but those were really great training years for me.
Channel 8 at that time, and we're talking about 1970 up until the mid-1980s, had a fabulous stable of reporters, just a fabulous stable of individuals. Recall some of them for us, would you?
I would say Mark Minnick, in terms of radio, was there. He was a great reporter. Gary Vincent used to be a State House reporter and would lug this 16 millimeter equipment up to the peanut gallery and shoot the legislature. But you know who really the best reporters were? Paul Rhodes and Russ Van Dyke. They were really active anchormen. They may not have been out in the field because there wasn't a lot of field reporting for anchors then. There was no live stuff, but they would write the news. Russ would hand me wire copy. There was a point when I was a writer for Russ on the 10 o'clock news, and I learned so much. He'd give me an AP story and the UPI version of that story. If there was any press releases, and said, write that and give me 25 seconds. And I'd write it out, and the reporter he'd look at it, and more often than not, he'd say, change this, do this. And that was such a learning and valuable experience for me. So I think in this case, the anchors were really great reporters.
That's because they were doing their own writing, they were doing their own editing and directing other shows,
Really, they did all of that. Also, Pete Taylor was a great reporter in the sports department. The late Pete Taylor, I miss Pete. George Wiley. I mean, there's just been so many. Jim Worthington was a good reporter back then.
Al Buck
at the Weather Map. And Kevin Cooney, remains today. I mean, Kevin's a great reporter. Used to do some great feature stories. Kevin Cooney covers Iowa when a lot of stations tried to imitate Charles Kuralt on CBS. Molly Cooney was one of the early female broadcasters in Iowa, and a lot of them are still there. They have a reputation of not a lot of turnover.
John Newell.
Yeah, John Newell at the Weather Map.
And Crazy John as a co-anchor.
Yes,
as I recall.
I think he did that, but most people remember John at the Weather Map. And he was part-time. I think he was still going to law school at Drake.
Right. The hairdos of that time, and particularly your sartorial splendor.
My beard was probably the most identifying factor for me, and I look back, and as probably everybody does in their earlier years, and I looked kind of silly. It was a little bit too long, and they weren't as accepted. I got a lot of hate mail over my beard. My hair was a little bit too long for the time, very innocent by today's standards. In fact, at one time, when I was reporting on camera, I had a short hair wig, and I would do my interviews or an on camera out in the field with this short hair wig. The National Guard was also required to wear these short hair wigs at a time when hair was just a little bit longer than generally acceptable by the public. And I got one of those things, and it sure looked silly. I had to go to the bathroom before I'd do an interview, and I'd walk out with this stupid looking short hair wig just to comply with, their desires. And then I'd take it off. But I looked a lot better without the wig. And the beard, at one time I shaved the beard, and they made a promotion out of it. Do you think you should grow it back? And yeah, they wanted me to grow it back. So I don't know if that was good or bad, but I ended up growing the thing back.
Terry Anderson was on the staff at Channel 8 at that time.
Yeah. Terry was another really great reporter. He did a lot of radio, and remember going to visit him and his wife. I think he lived up in Ankeny there for a while. And yeah, in later years, of course, he was with the AP and was in Japan and spent some time elsewhere too.
Well, of course, the hostage situation, and I, of course, remember his very distinctive signature, Terry Anderson, KRNT News.
He even ran for, was it Congress or Senate or something too?
I think that's right. Rick, what was it like back in those days to put a newscast together, either for radio and then for television?
For radio, you pretty much did your own thing. We relied on the wires. We also relied a lot on television. It was when I was with radio, it was still a radio TV shop. We were still combined before KCCI TV separated from KRNT Radio. So we would take the news film for television was, for the full newscast. For example, the 6 o'clock newscast, it'd all be spooled onto, the sound was on one reel of film, story with leader, another story, the next story, separated by leader. And we'd put that up in the newsroom, and we would dub off all of the sound onto audio tape. And could get, if there's the mayor had something to say, or any newsmaker, I could take out those segments along with the scripts from television, maybe rewrite them a little bit. And I was able to use television's audio for many of the local stories that were developed during the day, and the wires to write or pencil edit a lot of the times. So that was the essence of our radio newscast. Television had, Paul Rhodes was also the assignment editor. So during the daylight hours, the morning and the afternoon, when the news is being made, he would assign reporters and camera folks to go out and cover the reporters. And it was all film back then. We went through the various stages of film improving, from the old Oricon camera to the CP16 and editing, and all this took place right in the room. And ultimately it switched over to videotape, and we started with a great big videotape camera, and then it all started to get smaller again and more manageable, and the same with editing equipment. So film was largely the source of our television back then when I was doing it.
And with film, you were somewhat limited because the speed of the film was relatively slow in terms of light speed.
And you had to get it processed. I mean, film just isn't ready to work with immediately. As soon as you take it out of the camera, we'd run it downstairs to Dave in the film lab, and he'd call us when it was ready. It seems like it was something less than an hour when we could run down and get the raw film, and then you spool it through, see what you've got, and start your editing. And it took a lot longer to put a newscast together, and there was no live then.
The quality of the news. What do you think was the quality at that time?
Probably we'd be surprised that it's not as different as we might think it is. Certainly the technology has made it more urgent in terms of, we can report live from a scene, but they're still covering, the cute feature stories. They're still covering traffic accidents, amazingly. The other day, three kids from a high school were killed. That's news to anyone. But I think we might be surprised if we looked at a lineup of the news 40 years ago that it's maybe not as different as we might think. Technologically, it's different. And some of the stories back then might not have gotten on until the next day because of the time problem in filming and getting it processed. And whereas today you can just report on something live. Everything is more immediate today, not just in radio and television.
What was it like working with the late Paul Rhodes?
Paul was a real professional, great sense of humor, a private man. When Paul died earlier this year, he didn't have a funeral, or at least a public funeral, or even a memorial. And he was not in the business to be famous or to be a celebrity. That's the only job he had at KRNT, KCCI. Left as the news director, and he was in it because he was a professional. He was a stickler for accuracy, would make the assignments, and at the end of your assignment, he'd review your script and he would make the edits and say, change this. He was basically a teacher for the younger reporters that came through. He ran a pretty tight ship. He kept everybody pretty happy. He approved your vacations. He had a schedule. He was a very organized news director. He was also a great anchorman. He was not a fancy guy. He got the job done in a really professional way, and I'm really proud to have worked with him.
Why do you think the public liked him and accepted him for so long?
I think they knew he was a professional. When welcoming him from the newsroom into your living room, he was a guy you can trust. He's your next door neighbor. And also back then, George, television was still kind of new. He's probably one of the only guys that's done it to that point. So there was this trust factor, and there wasn't a lot of competing media like there is today. And the media is just so much more controversial now than it was back then, with Democrats and Republicans, and the hate that goes on between the politicians and the competing internet and cable and talk radio. I mean, it's just ballooned so much compared to what it was then. There's so much more at stake, and back then it was probably pretty calm compared to the way it is today.
Russ Van Dyke.
Russ Van Dyke had a lot of the same, maybe it's because they were these early pioneers that, that they learned it the old way. He had a lot of the same, really positive characteristics. He was trustworthy, he was credible, he was accurate. I've called Russ Van Dyke the Walter Cronkite of Central Iowa, maybe of all of Iowa. I don't have the luxury of having the history for, the other TV markets, but I think to this day, he's probably the best we've ever had in Central Iowa. And I don't mean to belittle anyone else, but he was smart. He understood the issues. He was great live when we were doing interviews or election coverage. He was the cream of the crop.
What did you learn from him?
I learned how to write. I learned what makes a news story a news story. I mean, you go through broadcasting, journalism, writing school, and you learn, the 5 W's: who, where, which, why, whatever, all, the key ingredients into a story. And you think you can write, but it really takes maturity and time in the job and a good teacher before you can recognize what the lead of that story. What are you going to put first? The who, the what, the why, the where? And a lot of it just comes from experience. And it helps to have somebody show you the right way or to help input. And Paul Rhodes helped too. But for Russ, I think the thing I remember most about him was writing and the basics of journalism. What makes a story a story? And also his lineup, watching him put together the newscast, just before, probably 30, 40 minutes before 10 o'clock news, he's got all these scripts. He starts to lay it out. Here's for the left column, here's segment A. Here's the second section of the news. Here's the third. Then we go to the weather and the sports. And then here's the final shorter section with maybe a kicker or something. And you watch him line them up, and what do you lead with in this segment? Why do you put this story behind this story? What ties together? What doesn't? So it was an invaluable experience for me in my first years of journalism.
Of course, Russ also did the weather for many, many years on Channel 8.
Yeah.
And you think that helped to add to his credibility and his likability?
Yes. And it also showed him as a human being. When you make a mistake, and I'm not saying he made a lot of mistakes, but when you're making mistakes in live television, there's nothing that shows your audience that you're a real person. How do you react to a mistake? Or, we all flub in our normal everyday speech. But on television, there seems to be a higher level of expectation that, when you see a reporter's story, they don't make mistakes because it's recorded and it's edited. But your anchorman and your weather man and woman, they're making mistakes all the time, and that just makes them human. It humanizes the broadcaster. But in Russ's case, and he had the map, which was a great, it looked like he was writing backwards on the weather map. In fact, the camera was pointing into a mirror, and the mirror was reflecting the image on the map. So Russ was writing right-handed and standing on the, with the map, looking at America the way it should look on the globe. But in fact, on your TV at home, it looked like he was writing backwards, left-handed, and it was one of the tricks that everybody got a kick out of that. So that doesn't hurt your image either. I think that map is at the Historical Society.
It's a great feature of Des Moines, just as the weather beacon.
Yeah. That used to be in the newsroom. It was the little box that looked like a stoplight. Red for weather warmer ahead, and green for no change in
foreseen.
And you're supposed to push the button. It's up to the reporters, and back then, it didn't get a lot of attention. So it might have been, today's rain might not be reflected in the weather beacon until the next day or something. But
Oh, kind of like the newscasts on FM.
yeah, well, television always gets, if that's what you mean, television always gets priority in a combined newsroom. You know, like, hey, we've got an hourly newscast coming up in 10 minutes. Who wants to do it? Well, nobody wants to do it. They'd rather be on TV.
Well, and when I was at a combination AM/FM, KRNT AM, KRNQ FM, the AM was the big dog at that point, and we'd always forget about the FM newscasts. Ever have that happen to you?
I guess we probably missed some, but I don't remember doing separate AM and FM. But when I was with CBS, it was the same problem. Television, especially when you're covering a story over, outside of your home area, a coup or a war or something, and they set up a news department. You've got radio and TV working out of the same newsroom, and radio is always the little brother that doesn't get as much respect.
Connie McBurney doing the weather.
Yeah,
What credibility she gained over the years.
she was great. She appealed to everyone, but being a woman in an early broadcaster, I think she won over men as well as women. She just had such a great charm about her. She was so non-threatening, and I know I just love Connie, and still miss her on the air. Although we've got the new tools that weather people use today, and you remember back when Connie used to have a static satellite picture, or maybe there was a little bit of a loop towards the end of her years on television, but she's a really beloved broadcaster.
And the weather back then, everybody went with the Weather Service forecast.
Yeah. I never did the weather, but I just introduced Connie, and she was great at ad-libbing too. She was just a natural. She had the gift of gab, if I can say that. She was I'm the kind of person that I'm a better writer and a preparer and a thinker in advance. I don't have. Really comes in handy to be a natural at ad-libbing and spontaneous thinker. I don't have, I'm wired just a little bit differently. So I would think about ahead of time what I'm going to say to Connie or to Pete, and she just was able to come back and make it work. They can make you or break you, and she made me look better than I really was. That's her job.
You spent about 12 years at KRNT, KCCI. Yeah. Then you went to CBS.
Well, actually, I went to another CBS affiliate.
Okay. Where did you go?
In Honolulu. My brother was living in Hawaii at that time, and I was kind of wanting to get back to Asia. That's where I cut my teeth there. I was a teenager in Vietnam, and after 12 years in Iowa, I was kind of wanting to see more of the world, and my career was blossoming, and I felt confident in myself and wanted to see more and do more. And I went over to visit my brother and his wife on a vacation, and I took some audition tapes and resumes and visited all the TV stations.
You're just like everybody else in the business.
I am. And I ended up getting a job with the CBS affiliate there. Bob Seavey, the news director, hired me. And a couple of months later, I was a reporter. I was a feature reporter and a fill-in, backup, weekend TV anchor. And I was there for 3 years and covered some really interesting stories there. Probably the thing I least expected to cover was a blizzard coming from Iowa. I got to cover a blizzard in Hawaii, and they do have them. We were on top of Haleakala, a mountain volcano on the Big Island. It's about 14,000 plus feet high, and there's a telescope city. There's a little city up there, maybe 8 telescopes. Some audio, some with the long traditional mirrors and lenses, and there was some event. I think they were monitoring an asteroid or an eclipse. I forget what it was, and we drove straight up without any acclimation. We were going to drive up, do the story, and drive down. We drove up, and a storm hit, a snowstorm at that elevation. It can happen anywhere, and they ended up they were socked in, so they couldn't do their event. There was people from Germany around the world were there for that event. And we couldn't drive down the road. There was snow, too high for cars to traverse. Plus, you're on a mountain. You can't take a chance. So we got stuck there overnight, and I got altitude sickness really bad. I mean, I had a terrible headache and was lethargic and breathing deeply. It really hit me bad. Fortunately, they had they know about this stuff. So there's oxygen tanks, and I was, laying on the ground with oxygen to help make it through the night. And by morning, the plows had got us out. And as soon as I got down to sea level, I was just perfect. It was that quick.
Was that one of those points that maybe you ask yourself, why did I leave Iowa?
No, I was in two snows. I was on the island, or on the volcano another time for a ski story. They had an international ski meet up there. But of course, they don't have ski, what do you call it, lifts. So, you'd ski down and you'd have to drive back up to ski. So, but no, it was a great place. I covered volcanoes. I covered the Kilauea erupted, and I got to do stand-ups in front of a 10-foot high wall of lava. 3 years I was there.
How was your decision met by management at KCCI? Because they had a pretty successful team with you and Paul at 6 and you and Russ at 10.
Well, I was being groomed to replace whichever one of them might have left first. So I think they were disappointed, and I kind of, the implication was that, I'm home, I'm back from Vietnam, and I'm here, we're number one. But, I had a good job offer. It paid, at that time, it paid $40,000 a year, which was,
that was real money.
25% more than I was being paid. Of course, the cost of living in Hawaii was a lot more too. But it fulfilled the desire in getting back to Asia, which is really what I wanted. It's kind of halfway there in the Pacific Ocean. So, I don't think they were too pleased that I left, but, they're still good friends there. And there was, I didn't burn any bridges, and it obviously didn't hurt ratings whenever I left. So
they just keep chugging along.
They just keep chugging along. And I think the only time that we were ever threatened was by Jack Cafferty, who's now with CNN. And I don't think there might have been one book on one newscast that they might have pulled ahead, but we maintained the lead in general, and they may have tied or something, but they never overtook us. And then he left for New York.
You eventually go to CBS.
Yes.
Tell us about getting the job with CBS.
When I was in Hawaii, I started going back to Asia on vacations. And one time in Bangkok, I stopped into the CBS bureau there. And luck plays such a big role in life, doesn't it? When I got my job at KRNT, I heard about it. And covering stories, luck is just such a crucial thing. You gotta know when it's luck and to seize the opportunity. So I was visiting the CBS bureau, and I found out that the CBS reporter had left, and the reporter's desk had been empty for 2 months. And I kind of hit it off with the cameraman. He was an Australian, Derek Williams, kind of a famous guy in Asia, covered lots of wars and has been in the region all his life. And he knew that I was a Vietnam veteran. I had experience in the region, and I said, hey, I think I might compete for this job. I love Bangkok, and the story, the position required living in Bangkok, but you traveled all around Asia as the hot spots would flare up. And he sent a telex back to the foreign editor who made the hire at that time, and talked about me, recommended me, and I went back, and I don't know, a month later, I was on the phone with Sam Roberts, and he made an offer, and another month later, I was, on my way to Bangkok to be the bureau chief for CBS News in Bangkok.
What is it like, or what are the duties and responsibilities of a bureau chief for an organization such as CBS?
Largely being aware of what's happening in your region, which is as far away as, there was a bureau in Tokyo, so I didn't really cover Japan, but there was a couple of big stories there. They need help. If the story is going to last a week, or the Marcos coup in the Philippines went on for days and days and days, the China story, the China revolt in Beijing, you need to bring in help. If it's just a story of 1 or 2 days, we can cover it on our own. But so I was in Japan a few times, but my beat was as far away as Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Northeast, China, Japan, Korea, Southeast, Philippines, Malaysia, a lot of it, Vietnam. Vietnam was the huge story back then, because I was there 10 years after Saigon fell. So it was just beginning to emerge from isolation. So, but to answer your question, my job is to monitor what's happening in the region. We had a wire, a Reuters wire, and listening to the BBC and the Voice of America on shortwave radio. And of course, we have a telex, so New York knows what's going on, the foreign desk. They're coordinating their worldwide coverage through their bureaus. Most of the time, if there's something in my area that I didn't know about, they just call me up, call me at home in the middle of the night, or send me a telex and say, we need you to get over here and take your camera. We had a camera crew, a part-time cameraman and his part-time sound man. I had a Thai reporter and a translator, and had a secretary. The secretary and I were the only ones that were full-time. But they'd pay overtime to the camera crew if they were somewhere. And I think they were only paid like 6 days a month. But so we kind of plan our coverage if it was a feature story. If it's a big story and they were somewhere for 2 weeks, no problem. They love the extra work. Being available is the key thing. And I did radio and television for CBS.
How many were you expected to produce so many stories over a period of time, or just as events happened?
Initially, when I was a full-time staff contract reporter for CBS, which was my first 2.5 years before they closed my bureau. Actually, they closed bureaus all around the world in one shot. Not really, but you feel there's always feature stories. If there's nothing breaking, you're working on a radio feature story. There's always something going on in the area. And you don't want to be too quiet, you want to be seen, you want to be heard, not necessarily on the air, but you do on the air too, because that's where CBS sees and hears you, the bosses, the other editors, your competing reporters. So it's a lot of preservation of your job, I guess, they're not paying you to just sit there and monitor things, they're expecting you to produce. So there was no quota.
Was it kind of a dream job?
It was great. Went on for 10 years. And after they closed the bureau, they laid off and closed bureaus all around the world. And it was a time when all the networks were doing it. Rather than, and I don't think it was necessarily a bad decision. They reduced their presence in Asia to just Tokyo. They had a Tokyo bureau. So when something happened in Bangkok or the Philippines or India, they might have a local reporter that was kind of their fixer over there. And if they needed to go into an area, they'd contact the fixer, have a car waiting, have our hotels ready, and they just fly in. They fly in with their whole crew and maybe 20 cases of batteries and lights and tapes and stuff. So they saved a lot of money by reducing the local, especially the American presence.
I seem to recall on one of the books I read about Edward R. Murrow that after World War II, he had made a tour of around the world, and it helped to set up this bureau system and had people with the CBS flag literally everywhere.
Oh,
is
really?
that what you found?
I don't know if he was the guy that did it, but it was a pretty good system. And frankly, the news would be a lot better today if they still had that system. It's just unaffordable. Plus, there are so many other agencies that you can hire, like Viz News, AP Video. They have local people at all these places. You can buy the film, you can buy the video from anybody. You don't have to pay your own staff, to be full-time or part-time to get it when it's available at a cost savings like that.
Well, now, when they closed the bureau in Bangkok, what did you do? I
called them and said, why do you want to close this bureau? I said, we are lean and mean. I was cheap. We had part-time people. But at that point, it was just headcount. They needed to reduce the numbers. They were bleeding red ink. And but I stayed on with CBS. I just had a more of an informal relationship through our relationship with TBS, and everywhere around the world except the U.S. TBS means Tokyo Broadcasting System. They were our partners in Asia. I got a desk at TBS in Bangkok and became essentially a freelancer. But I was their go-to guy for radio and television, and I got paid by the day. I got paid by the story rather than a contract. There were no benefits or anything, but I was still their guy. And I created my own news agency. I started to freelance for other people. I started to write stories for Asia Magazine and newspapers and for Australia radio and television, the BBC, the Canada Globe and Mail. I was able to expand my portfolio and had a really nice career as a little news agency guy.
Some of the major stories or some of the major events that you covered?
Vietnam, would it still be? I was probably in Vietnam 20 times or more, because there was still a fear that the Vietnam communists were holding Americans prisoner of war. There's a history of that in Asia, that they hold prisoners for long periods of time. And of course, there's all kinds of rumors all the time that, we saw a USA carved in a rice field from an airplane, and it's just, a normal marking of a field, but somebody thought it looked like a USA, like a SOS call for help or something. There's all kinds of rumors that would come in. And my freelance guy, who worked with the U.S. military at one time, would go into Laos. Most of these reports were in Laos, not in Vietnam, which borders Thailand. And we'd pay him money. He'd go in and have his little guys. It was an industry there. They'd find some dog tags. They were probably manufactured. Some were real, some weren't. But we went through the motions of checking it out. It would be a great story. And some guys did come out of the war zone long after the war ended. A lot of it was just, probably most of the time, it was just somebody who was AWOL and ended up running a bar in, Melbourne or something. But so Vietnam was the big story. Covered the fall of Ferdinand Marcos. And the people power protest, millions of people in the street that brought Cory Aquino to power. And years later, a few years later, when Marcos was living in Hawaii, I was on a home leave, and I had lunch with Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda at their seaside home in Honolulu, and I got the cover story on Asia Magazine, which is distributed in Sunday newspapers all around Asia. We have the same kind of, picture magazine here in the States.
What was that like?
I had requested to meet with them, and fortunately there was a famous, here's how it happened, because I never could have gotten in there by myself. There was a famous talk radio guy from Manila who apparently the Marcoses liked. He could have been like a Rush Limbaugh kind of person in the Philippines. And he was there. And obviously he got invited to lunch, and I think I got in on his coattails. And a lot of the lunch was in Tagalog. I couldn't understand a lot of it. He did most of the talking, and Imelda did a lot of talking. They were polite to me. I did interview Ferdinand on one-on-one later, and that was the essence of a story I had done on what his life is like. And, but he was pretty weak then, and Imelda was even he had a piece of chicken, I think, and she was cutting it for him. He was kind of in ill health at that time. But I got some pictures of him in his backyard, and again, luck, right? Luck. The big things in my journalism career are luck, and I don't think that's probably that unusual.
And that was going to be my question. How do you make that luck, or how do you be able to capitalize on the luck?
I think that journalism makes it happen, because makes it happen. You got to recognize a story. I can walk down the street and see a story. Just my normal driving home or at the restaurant, and if luck happens, a lot of time you might go, wow, I really feel good. I'm really lucky. But you got to seize it. You got to see it and recognize what the possibilities are. And it's sort of like identifying what a good story is, or what the lead of this story is, and kind of walking around it, looking at it from a different angle, and seeing the possibilities. So everybody has luck, but they don't always recognize it.
Goes back to the basics, doesn't it?
It does. Journalism has just been a great career for me. I love it.
And you love to tell stories.
I love to tell a story.
What makes a good story?
In television, the pictures, do mean a lot. The volcano eruptions in Hawaii were great. The big typhoon that hit the Delta in Bangladesh is the only lead story I had on the Dan Rather news. And wouldn't you know it, Dan Rather was off that night.
Maybe that was good.
Maybe that was good. Pictures do, make a lot in television. Emotion, anything that is emotional adds to the story. Uniqueness, exclusive, something that's exclusive, which really probably the things I've done that have gotten the most attention are feature stories. It's an unusual character. a lot of times just the basic news stories. I think we like to think we're doing a lot, but they're probably the most forgettable things.
What caused you to want to come back to Iowa?
The story was in decline in Southeast Asia at that time. No news is bad news if you're in journalism, and
particularly if you're working on a per story basis.
Right, and Vietnam was settled down, and Thailand was largely a story about tourism and growing economies. To this day, there hasn't been that much going on in Asia. Oh, there's still occasional coup in Thailand, but there wasn't enough to really sustain a career like I had. And, they were still laying off reporters. Reporters were moving to other key hubs in Asia out of Bangkok. It just seemed like a good time for me. And some family and my folks were getting older, and there were other reasons to want to come home. I had my wife is from Bangkok. She was a reporter there. That's how we met. And it seemed like it was an exciting time to come back for her to live in a new country for a while. And my brother had just moved back to the Iowa area, so it was a good time to come back. And I might end up back there again sometime too.
You've focused primarily on radio since your return. Why?
Age caught up with me. Whenever I came back from CBS, I don't think I've never been more qualified. I've never had a better resume than when I came back, working for a network, foreign correspondent, Peabody Award, all kinds of, credentials. But I'm a little bit older, and, you go back to a place like KCCI, and they're already number one. What am I supposed to do with them? So, but I made the rounds at the TV stations and thinking that, this should be a piece of cake, and it wasn't. And I started to broaden my search, and I heard about a job opening at WOI Radio, and it was a news director's job. And that's one of the things I'd never done, I'd never been in management. And I competed for that job in 1995 when I came back, and I became the news director for WOI in Ames, and was actually a state employee working for Iowa State University.
Did you like the job?
Yeah, and a couple of times in my life, I've had a little bit of burnout for whatever I'm doing, and that kind of kept me in the game a bit longer because it was new, and the way you do journalism in public radio is so different than commercial broadcasting, whether radio or TV. You've got a longer time to tell the story. You don't have to break for commercials. They rely a lot on sound, natural sound, as a way to help illustrate and tell the story. So it's really a radically different kind of journalism. In fact, it's probably more like television than it is commercial radio. And I liked, being able to shape the news as a news director. I think we added new programs, and I think I contributed to making the news department stronger. So I did like that and continue to like it today.
Your forte, it seems to me, in public radio has been your features, your Iowa audio archives, if you will.
Yeah, I've done that for 6 months now. It's a 1-year project. I left WOI for a couple of years and ended up going back. They have a reputation of people wanting to come back. And I came back as a host for All Things Considered on a part-time basis. And as this consolidation of Iowa Public Radio occurred, I ended up as their first arts and cultural reporter. Never had that in public radio, and that's my title now. And my first really big project is called Iowa Archives, which is not that different than the archives of Iowa broadcasting. We're interested in locating and preserving historic audio. I think it's the most neglected aspect of Iowa's history is its audio history. You can walk into a museum and see battle flags and machine guns and Model Ts, but you can't go in and play Jack Shelley or Herb Planbeck. because it's on a 16-inch record stored away in a box in the basement of the museum. There's also a lot of other material that's just being lost in private hands. Grandma dies, what's this box of stuff? Let's get rid of it. There's a lot of stress during that time. So we're kind of drawing attention to the importance of audio and then packaging this into really listenable little 4-minute stories during this year. And I love working with audio. I've found some really interesting things. My project goes a little bit beyond just broadcasting. We're locating all kinds of sound that might relate to Iowa's history. We did one on Riverview Park in Des Moines, which closed decades ago, but we found what I think are probably the last sounds of some of Riverview Park's sights and sounds that we can remember, and that was my series premiere. You could hear sounds of the Riviera Ballroom and the old life-size clown that was in the arcade there and used to scare kids instead of entertain kids because it was so weird. And we've got sound of that, and we're doing a couple a month now of these. And right now we're focusing on broadcasters, so it's good that the Archives of Broadcasters has preserved it. We could only hope to be as comprehensive.
What's the role of public radio, particularly in news?
I don't know that the role is that different than any commercial radio or television station. It's just that they have the time and the format to do it better. And a lot of it just comes to the commitment of not having to respond to ratings. They might be able to have a 10-minute interview with somebody that would never get on commercial radio because it might be boring. But public radio audiences like the attention to detail, the in-depth nature of our news. All things considered in Morning Edition are our morning, well, my cell phone just went off, but it'll start. But I don't think it's that different. It's just the goal, the mission is not that different, but the format allows them to do a superior job because they're not responding to ratings. They can put an hour show means an hour, almost an hour of programming rather than 20 minutes of commercials and 40 minutes of programming. Stories on Morning Edition and All Things Considered can be up to 7 minutes long. There's a lot of information there.
Can public radio do a better job of covering the news here in Iowa?
I think they can. I think we're getting there. We're still in the consolidation process right now at Iowa Public Radio. Rather than having 3 competing stations from Iowa State, Northern Iowa, and the University of Iowa, they all own their own public radio stations. Now we're working together. So rather than one reporter competing against the others at the State House, we coordinate our coverage at the State House. Rather than having 3 separate Morning Edition hosts, we have one host, and those 2 former hosts are out reporting or doing other things within the network. So that strengthened us in terms of staffing, but we've got to work at it. We can do a better job, and I think we often do a better job. But if we don't do it right, the commercial broadcasters, they could do a better job. I think television really does a good job in Iowa. I think, and of course, I only see what's in Central Iowa. A couple of our top stations here just do an excellent job of covering local news for the short amount of time they have in a half hour.
Tell us about your Peabody Award.
1987 in Beijing. This was the People's Protest. 1 million people covered Tiananmen Square. I was there for CBS Radio, ended up doing a few television stories, whenever their main reporters are tired or in bed and the morning news or the overnight news needs something, they call on the radio guy to do that. But I was primarily there for radio. The story essentially was a rapprochement between Russia and China. They hadn't even been talking for decades, and Gorbachev was there. So it was this big summit between the leaders of Russia and China. And the student movement in China saw the possibilities and the worldwide media in place And they had had some protest at a smaller scale before the summit started. But this thing grew into a huge march. I marched with the students from Beijing University to the big People's Square there, Tiananmen Square. And it just grew, and there's 1 million students there, sleeping on buses in the streets. And it went on for weeks before the tanks moved in. And the famous picture of the one student waving the flag in front of the Red Army, the Chinese Army tank. And actually, most reporters, including myself, were gone. Because we didn't know. If we knew it was going to happen, we would have been there. But after 3 weeks, Dan Rather, all the other big broadcasters had broken down, and they left a skeleton crew there. And even I had gone by then. But I was there for the excitement of the protest, and CBS Radio submitted their overall coverage for a Peabody, and as one of the key people in radio, I was included in the coverage, and I got a Peabody. So I'm really proud of that. That was in '89.
How does a man who grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, end up in China covering the revolution, and how does he cover it? Because my guess is you don't speak Chinese.
No.
You speak Des Moines. Yeah. How do you cover an event like that?
We have translators. And a lot of the times we would go out with maybe the TV crew, and the radio guy would be along, or I'd just be on my own with the Chinese translator. And you know where the story is. And just observation. I mean, you could write a story. You could write a story just by what you see, almost, and the signs that the protesters had, they're in English. They speak English rather than me speak Chinese. And they want to speak English to foreign reporters. They know what the international language is. If it's not the language of our country, English is definitely the language of the world. And a lot of Chinese speak pretty good English. So oftentimes you don't need. And when there's 1 million people there, quite a few of them speak English. So, it's not on every story that you even need a translator. If you're going to a press conference that some government official is going to take questions about the protest, are you going to move in? Are you going to let them go? Or are you going to meet with them? Are you going to negotiate? Then you might need an interpreter, but often you don't.
Have journalists, based upon your observations, gotten away from the ability to observe? Are they curious? Or do we have a crop of journalists right now who tend to be a little bit lazy and rely upon the news release from a public information officer?
Oh, I've done that. Sometimes you have to rely on a news release if you can't be at the site. I'm not sure what they're teaching now in J schools, but I think the power of observation should be a class of itself. I'm a little bit concerned by live television reports with the urgency of a reporter getting especially at a breaking story, getting on camera, getting on the air. They don't have time to report. I mean, you got to get the information before you can say it. There's no chance to report and observe because they're on camera all the time. Maybe they have an assistant and I'm just not aware of it. Somebody else is gathering this information. Observation is important, and I think it's part of our job. I mean, I don't think we've lost the importance of that.
Do you think sometimes we get, particularly in the broadcast media, we get hung up with the equipment? We allow the equipment to get in the way of doing the story, and maybe that's what you were saying when you were talking about the live reports.
Yeah, well, we can't do our job without the equipment. That's for sure. And from my generation, I'm frustrated a lot by the technology and the constant changes of digital editing systems. I've learned 3 digital computerized editing systems, And maybe next year I'll have to learn another one. Why does it have to change? But we can't resist it, and it does get in the way. But you can't do in television. You can't do the story if you can't get a good satellite to get your pictures up from Bangkok to New York, and then from New York to the system across the states. It can get in the way, but it's also necessary. And I know when it works right, boy, it's. I mean, there's so much more we can do with audio editing and video editing now that we couldn't do just fairly recently. In mixing sounds, I mean, my audio editing system has an unlimited amount of soundtracks. I could have 100 of them. My first audio system had 4, which seemed like enough. But now it's a luxury. So I it's only my generation. I shouldn't resist technology. It's good for us, and it keeps a lot of scientists in business.
Where do you see the next major stories?
Probably the first major stories worldwide.
Either here in Iowa, worldwide. What do you think is going to be the stories of the next decade?
I think that the terrorism story will determine. I think the terrorists are in charge to some degree of where the next big global story is, because we know how important a terrorist action is to not only security, but I think economy and security are, co-meshed. You can't separate the two. Look what 9/11 did to our economy and the airline industry and the travel industry and the defense industry. So you can't separate the two. Beyond, global terrorism, probably Asia. A lot of it is going to go back to Asia. The biggest countries in the world, China and India, have the fastest growing economies. They're also both nuclear countries. But their economies that's going to really be interesting. And if they have any designs on other countries like China, Taiwan, something could happen there. Vietnam is still an interesting place. Most Americans think Vietnam is a war, but it's a country, and the economy there and tourism is just flourishing. China Beach used to be a TV program. On Da Nang is now, there's 5-star hotels going up along the South China Sea. But the big stories, I think, are going to be economy, China, India, and of course, terrorism and the Middle East under one headline.
Do you see reporters here in Des Moines, Iowa, as giving the public the amount of information that they need about those areas?
The reporters in Iowa, it's probably not their job so much to cover the world as Iowa, but that information is more available than it ever has been before. So nobody has an excuse for not getting any information. Between the internet and cable and radio and television, and magazines and newspapers, it's all out there. There's no excuse for not being informed.
Now, I think you represent what has been seen in the field of journalism as a real merging of print, television, and radio. Has that been a challenge to you?
Probably has been a challenge, but I really enjoy it. I like filing. We have a website at Iowa Public Radio. I really like to post my stories there and to write the little headline and the date of the story and help decide what graphics or photo we should use to illustrate that story. And I can't put a picture on the internet, but I can write it. And the common thread between all the media sources, radio, TV, is writing. And there's nothing I like more than writing. I think I'm better at writing and producing and editing. And editing is basically presentation. It's a form of writing. That's the common thread that I really like writing more than anything else.
Goes back to those basics you learned from Paul Rhodes and Russ Van Dyke.
And we don't know. We can't imagine how important when Paul Rhodes died earlier this year. he had such an imprint and an important focus for me in those years that I'm still drawing on that experience today. I just don't identify it with Paul Rhodes, but it's still there. So, yeah.
It's something that we talked about a little bit last week, but, and maybe it's elaborating, and I apologize for leaving during part of this, but you made the rounds when you came back, and I guess it's already 95, so it's already been 12 years. What, making the rounds of the stations, was it just not the right situation for you? And then a corollary to that is television news now something that I don't want to say is distasteful, but there's so many things about it that, boy, just give me public radio anytime. You know what I mean? I know when I'm doing a radio interview or when I worked in public radio, it's a whole different thing than when I worry about doing election night on TV as I do, because there are so many other things that to me have nothing to do with getting the information out. Mm-hmm. Spin off of that, if you would. I mean, do you what do you think? I mean, if somebody called right now, let's say that Channel 13 called and said, you've still got great name recognition, and John Bachman has decided to leave, and here's an opening. Does that have any appeal for you now, as it might have 12 years ago? Or
I would listen to that, although the routine of that, I'm afraid that I might, after a couple of years, if I was even able to survive that long, there's no job security. That's a real issue in television. And when I came back in 95, I was probably a little bit overconfident, thinking that my credentials, my name recognition, I left as number one in the market. I mean, excuse me if I thought I could get a job in the little market of Des Moines, Iowa, after coming home from CBS. I met with every station. I met with, some of them didn't even know who I was. I mean, things had changed that much. So that's part of the reason, but I think it's a reflection on them rather than me. So I didn't take it personal. I am older. In the case of KCCI, I mean, if you're already number one, what can I don't have anything to offer them. But I could have been a reporter or something else. Anyway, there's no hard feelings at all. If somebody came to me with an offer, I would listen to that. I do think that I have the maturity, and people still know me from television. In fact, I think more people remember me from television than they do right now from Iowa Public Radio. Public Radio's got a great loyal audience, but it's a core audience. Television is oops, sorry, microphone. So I don't know. I'm older too, and let's face it, youth is important in the game of television.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing, and again, I do things on TV, top rated station in the market, but I'm on what? A few times a year, and the amount of times that I get recognized in Waterloo and Cedar Falls just stuns my wife. She said, well, you have a certain look and people remember you and all this, but there's no reason why people should recognize me. But it does show the pervasiveness of it. But again, it's just such an ugly, the cosmetics of it. I mean, that's the thing that I guess it makes, I can see that sameness of reading the same, you mentioned routine. The cosmetics of it, it's kind of,
there's a lot of motions you have to go through before you get to the seed of the journalism mission of the news. And, I'm amazed that the public just hasn't got over this celebrity thing of television after, 50, 60 years of television. I mean, they still think, oh, put me on TV. When is this going to be on TV so I can watch it, or I can call everybody and see that they still have this fascination with television. That is one of the things that I didn't like. If a local station called me and asked me if I wanted to anchor, I think I'd be more apt to consider something in a reporting, feature reporting or investigating. I never got off on the celebrity side. I'm a very private person, and I don't like to be recognized out there. It's a 24-hour a day job when it comes to being recognized. And if I'm, pushing my cart through the grocery store, I don't really like people to, look at me and see what I'm buying, or if I'm having dinner with my wife, somebody comes over, hey, what's the weather going to be? I don't even do the weather.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I never, and a lot of people thrive on that. And I think in television, it's good to have a little bit of that, but it shouldn't be the driving force behind it.
And again, it's changed clearly because, again, we were in the line at Burger King. There was a mayoral runoff election in Waterloo. Well, they didn't need me to come down for it. And we're at Burger King and people are staring. This is in Waverly, it's a nice small town. Guy finally looks over and I'm thinking, he finally said, shouldn't you be down at the TV station? Well, and I think of my little corner of the world. And then I think of someone who's on every night, as you said, still the key recognition. And I find that a lot of people are fairly private and don't, they like to do their jobs, but they don't like that recognition. And now it seems like you have to be available for every ribbon cutting also for the station. It's not just that you can go in and read.
That's outreach, I guess, right? They call that outreach.
If it's sold, but I guess that. And
I do that in public radio too.
Well,
we're expected to. It's not forced upon you, but to kind of fly the flag and spread the good news about Iowa Public Radio. I like to do that because I believe in it.
And I think maybe there's the difference between, for example, public radio, as it's done here, and certain aspects of commercial television where it's very hard to believe in it. Maybe that's a good exit point is for people like Paul or Russ, how would they feel about, in essence, what TV news has become? Because, it's now been quite a while since either one of them, of course, would have been in it. How would they have adapted to these newest changes from your experience of how they handled the role of consultants and ratings and everything else before?
We were involved with a little bit of the consultant stuff. I think they would be disappointed. I think they would be astonished at the technological advances, which overall have made our job easier once we can overcome the learning process. But they'd probably be astonished at the celebrity aspect, and it goes beyond just news. Maybe I'm talking about like the cable television programs, the talk shows that are so biased to one or the other side of the political aisle, and the way they focus on an abduction of somebody. They make it a national story when the same thing might happen 10 times a month. And but this one has captured it. They've turned this story into a national story, and they talk about it forever, and the inaccuracies and the speculation, and a lot of times nothing turns out. I'm drifting from your question about news, but I know that Paul, I think Paul and I were a lot alike in terms of being private people. He would not like going out. He would not like to be in the back seat of a car in the Iowa State Fair parade with a Channel 8 on the side.
Yeah.
He might have to do it, but
not happily.
We'll survive it.
We've survived others.
Yeah, television did not kill radio. Radio did not kill newspapers.
And the internet is not going to kill everything else.
Rick, do you see?
This is cross-examination. This is redirect.
Yeah, redirect.
We'll take this question time.
Yes. Do you see TV8 today upholding the traditions that Paul Rhodes and Russ Van Dyke laid?
Yeah, I do. In terms of accuracy, there's so much more news on. Even we're talking KCCI. When I left, there was a noon news, a 6 o'clock news, and a 10 o'clock news. Was there a morning newscast?
Maybe.
I don't remember.
Probably cut-ins at best.
But now there's, maybe just cut-ins. Now there's morning news. There's 5 o'clock news, 6 o'clock news. There's weekend news. Weekend news, weekend morning news. There's probably twice as much time for news than there was when I left. And the urgency, the immediacy of getting it on the air is so much better than it was when I was there. But the mission is still, I think a lot of times it's better. Weather. The radar stuff is just amazing with what they can do with that.
I'm totally amazed by what the radars can do.
But there's still a lot of, we're still out there being fed press releases and news. There's still a lot of this event-driven news that everybody has to do on a slow day to fill up your newscast. If you got a newspaper and there's no news, you have a thinner newspaper. If you're in broadcasting and you have a slow news day, you have to create some news to fill the time. It's still 24 hours in the day. So broadcasters have a bit of a problem there. And but I still see it too much, sending out a media release that we're having a press conference, and we're still being, somebody's pulling our strings here quite a bit. I wish there was more on the street, what do you call it? The kind of journalism where you go out and you find enterprise reporting. I wish there was more of that. Investigative reporting doesn't have to be, a 1-year investigation, but there's so much out there that I would like to see more on than just press conferences. And all news departments in every media get caught in that because it's easy. Sometimes it does produce a story, but you can take a news conference and you can take that news conference and then make it and this is what we do in public radio, make it a much better story, getting reaction to it, expanding on it, looking at it from another side, and covering it like no other, reporter at that press conference would cover it. And that's a sign of a really cutting edge newsroom.